All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us going here this morning. My name is Addie and I'm with the Carolina Thread Trail. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Great Trails State Plan and Trail Forum 2020. Before we get going, I just want to point out to all of our attendees that alongside the video feed that you see on the right-hand side, there's a question and answer box. So feel free to pose questions to our speakers. And we are going to devote the last 15 minutes of our session this morning for your questions to be answered. So anybody that has a question, please go ahead and ask that in the question and answer box in Whova. You can also vote for your colleagues' questions if the question that you were hoping to have addressed has already been answered. But without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Joining us this morning is Jason Reyes, a certified planner and a senior planning associate with Alta Planning and Design. Additionally, we have Katherine Zarang, a transportation planner with the North Carolina Department of Transportation Integrated Mobility Division. And we have Jake Petrosky, a certified planner and planning manager with Stewart Municipal Planning. I will turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Addie. Again, Jason Reyes with Alta Planning Design. Very glad you all could join us this morning and excited to present this plan. This is a basic outline of our presentation. Just I'm going to give a brief background and tell you how we got to the network development stage. And then Jake is going to walk us through the implementation strategy and the draft plan that we put together. And Katherine's going to share a little bit of information about our public engagement throughout the process and some of the successes there. So just to get started, looking back at the very beginning of this process, we started this by coming to a point in North Carolina's history where we've had 2 decades of progress across the state for long distance trail networks, local and regional planning, and other efforts that have really just sort of evolved over the years and just had a lot of success that we wanted to build on. And so you had things like the MST, the East Coast Greenway, Carolina Thread Trail, and other regional plans, and agencies and organizations that were making great success within their own region or within their own corridor. And when you started to put that all on the map for North Carolina, you started to see that there was only so much in between them that needed to be figured out. And so that was one of the ideas behind this plan, was sort of stitching all these things together. One of the other things that happened more recently in the past 5 years or so is just some great progress in terms of marketing the state as the Great Trail State, in terms of getting out information about what's on the ground today and what you can go enjoy and use throughout the state today. And then we've also had a 3-year study by NCDOT and ITRI with this economic impact of shared use paths across North Carolina. And that was looking at the economic impact from trail users in 4 different trails. And we interviewed people along the trail, had them fill out surveys about their spending habits related to the trip, et cetera. And we're able to do, just a lot of research in terms of the literature review of what's out there in the US for economic impact of shared use paths altogether. And so that really sort of gave us the basis of the argument for the impact that these types of investments have on North Carolina in particular, and gave us one more reason to go for this across the state. These are some of the figures from that study, looking at the estimated $26.7 million that went into construction for those 4 trails, and then looking at some of the outcomes related to that. And what it all boils down to is $1 of trail construction supporting 1.72 annually on return on investment for various items, and you can see them listed there. And that's a huge return when you think about that happening annually throughout the life of the project. So that's just one argument going into this, and I think a big one. Looking at some other states was another impetus behind this project. We know there's been a lot of success in Florida and Ohio and New York and Oregon, California, Colorado, and other places that have just had a lot of focus on this idea of a statewide network. They all look a little bit different in terms of how they make their approach to it, but we just thought for North Carolina that it would be a good idea to start doing the same thing here, and maybe even taking it a step further. And so that's what we've done. So when you look at this overall, with the vision that we're going for here, It's to connect communities to the great outdoors, creating opportunities and benefits for trails that we all know about. Most people at this conference probably are well aware of all these different types of benefits, but really that idea of connecting all 100 counties, I think, is a big deal, because that's something that goes a step beyond what some of the other state planning efforts were doing. And it's a challenge. There's a lot of ground to cover, quite literally there. And so that was one of our efforts going into this. The other thing, thinking about trails and what we're talking about here, we are really looking at shared use paths mostly for this plan. They don't necessarily have to be paved, but we want them to be able to support travel by bicycle. The main funder of the plan is NCDOT, and so we wanted to respect the fact that we do want these corridors to also be used for transportation, not just recreation. And so that was one of the things behind this. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore other options for connecting to other types of trails and having those as a destination for the system. And who knows what future versions of the plan will look like going into 5-10 years into the future. We might want to expand that definition, but anyway, looking at the overall planning process that we did, starting about this time last year, initiating the project, and then having a kickoff meeting in February of this year, going into all our existing conditions analysis, data collection. We had 14 meetings across the state that originally were planned to be in person before COVID. And those ended up being remote. And I think we may have actually done better with those being remote because we are trying to cover such a large area, and having so many people be able to attend those meetings, I think was actually an advantage to having it done virtually. And so, having those 14 division meetings with stakeholders and 5 meetings with the committee really helped us form the plan. And you can see as we walk through the next steps, what some of that involved. So starting with data collection, we've got 50,000 square miles in North Carolina to cover for this plan. It's a pretty large study area for a trail plan. And so we asked for forgiveness right off the bat with the data collection because we knew that the data wasn't going to be 100% accurate going in. And so we had to do a lot of data cleanup along the way too. And some of the things we started doing along that to collect data was looking at the PBIN and the pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure network managed through DOT and others, and looking at the existing trails that were out there today. This is actually an old slide here. This was one of the earlier ones before the data was cleaned up, but it does still give you a sense of where some of the clusters of existing trails were, near Charlotte and Raleigh and the Triad there. But then also looking at things like the East Coast Greenway corridors, the Mountains to Sea Trail. We also took into account the on-road connections for designated regional bike routes through NCDOT, because those might come in handy some places where we need to make an on-road connection. And then just looking at overall with the state with 100 counties, what that means in terms of all the, all the jurisdictions that we would be traversing and interacting with along the way. And we thought that a more reasonable way to break down the plan itself logically would just be by divisions, because that's 14 is a lot easier to handle than 100, and it also gave us a framework in which to do the outreach and to gather stakeholders and things like that. And so that's how the plan is set up itself in terms of breaking down the state. The other thing to consider is all the local planning that's been out there today. I mean, just look at this map and look at all the work that has been done over the past, 20 years or so in terms of identifying walking, biking, and trail connections. Almost every one of these plans has some form of trail recommendation within it. And, not only that, with the local plans that you see on the map, but along the outside of the map, you can see some of the regional planning efforts that have gone along the way, and those are all multi-county, some of them 5 or 6 counties, Carolina Thread Trail even more. And then looking at our connections to state parks as destinations and state park trails as destinations as well, and connections that we want to make with our overall system. And then finally, looking at how we can take advantage of some green infrastructure corridors as potential corridor planning opportunities. And this is just one example from Esri's Green Infrastructure Initiative, looking at intact habitat cores. And that gives you a sense of where some of those sort of non-typical infrastructure, but more green infrastructure connections might be located. So that's a lot of information. That's a lot of data that went into our analysis. And I probably missed some of them, but those were the main ones that we looked at. And then the other aspect of it on the other side of the data is the human side of it, and getting input from people who are involved on the ground, who are making decisions related to this in their own communities. And so we had a steering committee, and we had a stakeholder group. The committee was about 40 members representing each of the 14 divisions, several RPOs and MPOs, different statewide departments and organizations. And then on the other side of that, in the more detailed, division by division outreach, if you added all the people up that we invited to those meetings and that we emailed and that had input on the process, there was about 600 of those folks weighing in, and that really helped us guide the process on a more local level. This is an image of the kickoff meeting from February. This was pre-COVID, obviously, but it did give us a chance to actually sit down and meet as a group, which I thought was really important before COVID hit. I know that we can do a lot of things virtually and remotely, but it was great to get everybody together in one place to get us around all 14 division maps with representatives from those areas and get us off on the right, get us started on the right foot with our process. So that was really important. This is our group overall. And then with those individual stakeholder meetings I mentioned, the real focus there was identifying the main routes that might connect between counties for each one of the divisions. And so you can see those 14 thumbnail images of the different divisions, each one of them having, I guess, 6 to 8 counties or something like that in them. And then looking at the connections across them and what's most viable. And so that was a big part of that. And then, making the connections between those areas was the next step there. And so you can see how some of that unfolded while we were developing the draft network. So again, we started early in the year, had a draft plan the mid part of the year, and then where we're at now at the end of the year. And so at the very beginning, like I said, the existing trails, existing plans, the destinations, the committee, those types of things I just went over informed that first draft of the network. That went out to the 14 stakeholder groups. We confirmed the network that we were going for. We looked at those edges of the counties and made those connections across the counties. And in some places, some parts of the state, this was an exercise of finding new connections that weren't there before. In other places, it was looking at all the recommendations that were on the map and trying to find ways to prioritize different connections rather than putting everything on the map. So it was a different strategy depending on how dense the planned and existing network was, but that was one of our tasks. And then looking at, once we got to that stage, then we were just reviewing what was left in terms of the alternatives and the gaps. And we met with other groups like the Rail Division, and we started incorporating the public input that we were collecting, which Katherine's going to talk about in a little bit. So that brings us to the overall network, and this is pretty exciting. This is the first time that this sort of network has been put together that connects all 100 counties. It is proposed, obviously, but it's a big thing to have it all in one place. And you can see here that we have, there's this one piece of it that's in sort of a white outline. That's a potential spine network, and those are corridors that had a little bit more momentum behind them in terms of planning that's been going on the ground, and some of the connections to existing trails that are already on the ground as well. And so that helped us form sort of what we consider a spine network to build off of from there. And you can see some of that breakdown here. And so overall, looking at 3,600 miles of proposed trails in that overall network. But if you look at just that spine network, we've got about half of that. And so that really sort of puts a focus on it. The other thing to point out here is that the gap isn't necessarily a trail gap. It's more a connection that's desired but lacks more specific route planning. And so these are some areas where there wasn't a recommendation on the map before, where we've identified a need for the connection, but more planning needs to go into exactly where that trail would be located. So again, existing in this sort of lime green yellow, and proposed in green and orange there. And I'll just go back one more second so you can see that there. So then it comes down to how we want to break out the system for actual planning purposes and for people to actually go forward with implementation. For the plan itself, the actual document that will be available for review soon, this is how the network's broken out really broadly in terms of just, town to town or major destination to major destination. And there are fewer of them than an actual, implementation table that we're putting together that has it broken down. I think we have 578 individual segments in that table. So we figured that this is probably not useful for, for people just looking at the big picture that want to get a snapshot of what we're trying to do with the Great Trail State project. But this is more for people on the implementation side of things that want to see, what the specific breakdown is, what the type of trail that we're talking about, the mileage, jurisdictions, and things like that. And so that's two different sort of tools for implementation there. And then the other thing happening with the communication about the plan itself, we have an executive summary that we put together in draft form, and then on the back side of that, we'll have different division maps so that these can go out in different forms to different divisions, and people can just get a snapshot for what it looks like in their own community. So these are the back sides of those maps where we call out all the existing trails and all the connections that are proposed within the Great Trail State. So I think those will be really useful for elected officials and for other people that we need to talk to in terms of getting support for the trail. And here are some examples from the Thread Trail area. And so you can see, this is a great example of where, we didn't pick up every part of the Thread Trail, but we talked with people from the organization and others in the region about what might make sense for the Great Trail State as far as more inter-regional connections. And so that's what you see here. But before I pass it off to Jake, I just want to say that, this is really a huge deal. It's the first time in the state's history that we've identified proposed network for all 100 counties. And those investments in rural and urban areas, I think, is going to be very important. Having a way to propel the trail connections through our rural areas of the state is going to be absolutely critical. We know we've had a lot of success in urban areas, a lot more funding available through bonds and other initiatives in those areas. And we want to help support that, the other end of that, making those connections across the state as well. And just, having all the planning work that's gone into it. If you think about the decades of planning work and efforts and all the committee meetings, all the public meetings, all the maps that have been marked up along the way, having that all tied in and brought into one place, I think is just a huge deal. And then the next step is just going to be how we actually go about implementing and putting it together. And I think Jake is going to start touching on some of that here.
Yeah. So as with any plan, you spend 8 months on it, and we have to capture the essence of it in a document, and that's in draft form. It's being reviewed by the steering committee right now. The goal is to have it adopted by the DOT board sometime in March, and it would be available for review well before that. You can go to the next slide, Jason. It'll have that executive summary in it, vision and goals for the plan, a little bit of talk about the development of the statewide network, and then recommendations in the form of the maps and the network maps, and then strategies and action steps to how we move forward after this. A big part of that is funding, and then a 5-year implementation plan. Go to the next slide. Some of the major recommendations and how we get this thing on the ground, refining and designing the connections. So a lot of these have already been planned. Some of them have had some segments have had feasibility studies. Some even have had some design on them. But there's a lot of work to be done, especially in rural areas, to refine this network and understand, what alternatives are most feasible. Understand what are the best routes to connect the gaps that are missing between key destinations and regions. The Integrated Mobility Division at NCDOT and their planning grants and RPOs and MPOs and local governments and regional trail organizations and nonprofits all have a role to play in refining and designing those connections. Trail designation, branding and wayfinding is also something that can start really immediately. The great news is we have 500 miles of this GTS network, this Great Trail State Network that exists already. So designating parts of that network and building momentum and for what's already on the ground, but also connections that are on the horizon is a logical next step. Wayfinding and branding, there's some work to be done there. How do you do a wayfinding plan for 50,000 square miles? There's some precedents that we have in the document. We work with MobiCon on this as well, and they gave us a great case study from Holland in a regional trail plan that simplifies the wayfinding a bit based on kind of destinations at the end of each segment that we're recommending to be pursued a little bit. Trail-friendly policies. This is going to be key to getting things on the ground. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Coordination with implementation partners. This is not meant to be a DOT-led plan, and just the involvement that we've gotten from stakeholders in the steering committee. This is really going to be a bottom-up state plan. So a lot of implementation to be done on local and regional partners. Creating accountability at the division level will be important, and then also evaluating and updating this plan. This is meant to be a living document and meant to be refined as routes get refined and identified. Tourism and engagement is also touched on, getting people out and using this network, engaging folks, typical users and underrepresented users, and then also engaging rural communities and understanding how these trails can add value to those communities, be part of it. And there's a lot of steps in how we get from a line on the map to trail on the ground, and that's outlined in the plan as well. So, as I said, 580 miles of the Great Trail State Network exists. So designating those Great Trail State segments similarly as the East Coast Greenway does can really help build momentum and also help folks recognize the importance of these trails and really elevate them as key statewide infrastructure is really the goal there. And then there's future tasks on the branding wayfinding side of things. So trail-friendly policies. And some of these already exist at the state level and regional and local levels, but implementing the existing Complete Streets policy will be essential in getting segments of these trails on the ground. Particularly in rural areas, some of these segments, the best opportunity to connect them with a safe, comfortable, attractive trail is in tandem with planned roadway projects. So hopefully this Great Trail State Plan will be recognized as a significant plan and really be the impetus for inclusion of side paths in tandem with some of these roadway projects. Maintenance is a big issue that needs to be addressed. A lot of municipalities have the capability to maintain trail networks and greenway networks. Some more rural counties may not. So getting the trails within DOT right-of-way where possible will be important to getting not only a trail on the ground, but also making sure we figure out the maintenance piece of the puzzle. And bridges are kind of an important thing, and along with no new deficiencies. So making sure that we identify this network ahead of time to where when we replace bridges, we get facilities on the bridge or under the room under the bridge to accommodate these trails is really important. In order to make sure that some of the biggest barriers are addressed proactively, because it's a lot easier to accommodate them ahead of time. Implementation partners, it's really going to take all hands on deck to get this thing done, and that's kind of traditional trail agencies and lane managers and RPOs, MPOs, nonprofits, everybody involved. And to illustrate kind of the importance of these implementation partners, get a next slide, Jason. This is a map of the network down from Kinston and New Bern to Havelock and Jacksonville. And you can see the ecological corridor analysis that was done with this plan, the kind of gradations of green. A lot of these trails go through really ecologically important areas. And then the brighter green is managed areas. So land managers are going to be a really important part of implementing this network. About 600 miles of planned trails traverse parkland or conservation easements, Forest Service land, and understanding how those trails can be accommodated, and really refining the design in order to make sure that we reduce conflicts and provide a route that works for everybody is going to be really important. Trail funding, that section of the plan talks about the existing breakdown of funding, how trails get built now, how trails can be built tomorrow. There's a big ask in the plan and a recommendation to establish a sustained, a dedicated source of funding for trails in North Carolina. The ask is a $30 million initial investment with identifying a reoccurring amount. Some recommendations for allocation and project selection and requirements. And then there's also a big recommendation to modify the STI law to allow for state funding to be used for independent bicycle and pedestrian projects. And also some recommendations for modified project scoring in the STI process. So those are some big asks, but hopefully in the long run, it will get more money for trails in North Carolina. We look at, as Jason mentioned, we looked at some other peer states for how they do things for inspiration. And Florida was one that we gathered a lot of inspiration from. Their shared use non-motorized trail program provides a reoccurring allocation of $25 million to get those trails implemented. So that's something that we're modeling the recommendations in the Great Trail State Plan after. Another alternative, if you look to New York, they have dedicated $200 million to trail construction and brought in a lot of other sources really to get two main trails built. And this is an interesting case study because Andrew Cuomo announced the Empire State Trail idea and plan to knit together some regional trails and really make it happen on a really short-term basis. He announced this in 2017, and they're nearing the completion of the Empire State Trail as we speak. Actually, most of it's already been completed. So just in 3 years, they were able to get a significant state trail on the ground and address some barriers that locals and regional efforts really haven't been able to address. And some of those were river crossings and some other big ticket infrastructure items. When we look at peer states, North Carolina ranks towards the bottom in annual budget for independent bicycle and pedestrian projects. And that's something that we'd like to see addressed, and we're calling that out in the plan and providing some other examples for what we can try to emulate. Why trails? Why now? That next slide, Jason. You there, Jason?
Yeah, sorry, it's showing on my screen. I don't know why it's not showing up yet.
Okay, well, that's fine. So there's a part in the document where we talk about trails and the importance of them, and it's particularly important right now. The usage of trails has grown exponentially. I'm sure you're going to hear about that today, due to COVID and people just getting outside. Increases in 300% I've seen on the Neuse River Trail, and similar increases elsewhere. This is something that people want. The tie to economic development is real and documented. We need more case studies on that, but the case is pretty strong right now.
Jake, are you seeing the screen yet? I'm just curious.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I am. Also, there's a need to address kind of the urban and rural equity in trails. There's been a history of trail planning and funding in more urban areas, but the rural areas do need some help catching up. Importance for public health, and as I mentioned, and then the importance of trails as regional and statewide infrastructure is really emphasized in the plan there. You can go to the next slide, Jason.
I think it's running just a little bit slow here.
Okay. And then lastly, just as part of the implementation, there is an action plan that kind of ties specific actions back to the bigger goals. And the goals are foster connections between urban and rural areas in all 100 counties, provide transportation options for people of all ages, backgrounds, and abilities, create opportunities for conservation, recreation, education, environmental tourism, and economic prosperity, direct financial resources to the system, and facilitate those partnerships that'll help develop and maintain the system. So all this is in draft form, but stay tuned because the draft plan will be out soon.
Awesome, thank you, Jake. And Katherine, before we switch over to you, I just wanted to be sure the slides are advancing for you as they should. Are you seeing the title slide, Katherine?
Yeah, I didn't have any lag time, so I saw like whenever you were switching.
Okay, great.
They switched for me as well. All right, well, yeah, thanks, Jason and Jake. So now I'm just going to go over some public outreach. And before I get into community engagement, I wanted to briefly talk in a little bit more detail about stakeholder engagement with the rail division and rail companies, and exploring opportunities for rail with trails projects. We knew early on that, rail corridors were going to be key to this statewide network. And so, and we also understood the challenges of, coordinating with rail companies to try to, implement rail to trail projects or rail with trail projects. So very early in the process, we coordinated very closely with the rail division, and we talked about ways that we can partner with them to have a conversation with rail company owners, specifically short line rail company owners. We already know, the policies involved with coordinating with Class 1 rail companies like CSX and Norfolk Southern. And so, in our early conversations with the rail division, since they already have these built-in partnerships and relationships with shortline rail owners, we coordinated through the rail division in order to schedule meetings with each of the rail companies, the shortline owners, and talk through, any opportunities where we can coordinate on rail with trail projects for the Great Trail State Plan. And so we held several meetings, and of course we did get a lot of no's. That's to be expected, but we did get excellent feedback and support and interest from 2 rail company owners who were really interested in building out trails along their rail corridor, because it did meet some of their interests in trying to expand, rail tourism, and a lot of shortline rail company owners, these are local and regional companies, and they're invested in the local and regional economy, where their rail corridors are. And so we really use, the FTA Rail with Trail lessons learned guidance. That's a new guidance document that was updated in March 2020. So highly recommend reviewing that document if you're interested in rail with trail projects. And so that really helped to facilitate the conversation. And of course, the conversations were first led by the rail division, who had these established relationships, and then we kind of led a joint meeting to discuss opportunities. So we're really excited about, partnering with ACWR and BLU. Those are the two rail companies that want to see trail along their rail corridors. And we really think these two projects could be, just the start of additional rail with trail opportunities throughout the state. Next slide, Jason. So now going into some community engagement. So of course, with COVID, all of our community engagement plans that we really had to shift because our community engagement for this project did begin in March, late February, early March of 2020. And so a lot of the engagement did have to move to online engagement. And so the bulk of our input early on was through a public survey. So we extended the length of how long the public survey was open for. It was open from the end of February through the end of September. And we had a 10-question survey. And then we also had an interactive web map, which you can see there's a screenshot of the web map there, where, with the 10-question survey, the public provided kind of more general information about their interests in trails and destinations that are important to them. And then with the web map, they were able to actually provide specific recommendations for, opportunities within their communities where they'd like to see trails, what are the challenges to their current trail networks. And so we use that to incorporate into the draft network. And we received over 11,000 survey responses and then 850,000 impressions for this survey effort. Next slide, Jason. And then, so of course, like I mentioned, in light of the pandemic, we really heavily utilized the NCDOT Communications Office and their expertise with helping to develop an outreach plan, for the Great Trail State effort. And so they created a really robust social media campaign. So using traditional social media on NCDOT accounts, they also developed toolkits for social media graphics and messages so that groups sharing the survey can easily share the information on their local and regional social media accounts. And then throughout the process with the survey, I was able to, review all of the input that we were getting in real time. And then when I saw where we had maybe areas within the state that was kind of lagging in input, we were able to geo-target those areas and push outreach in those specific regions so that we can get more input, so that it's we're getting a good sample of input from all across North Carolina. And then also, of course, we NCDOT Communications developed a traditional media campaign as well with the project web page, newsletters, and press releases that went out that resulted in over 50 media news articles or television slots as well. And then of course we closely partnered with NC State Parks, and they were actually able to put up posters with survey QR codes in the state parks. Since we're seeing an increase in so much people hiking and visiting state trails and state parks, we were able to use that to be able to have some sort of like in-person outreach. And then this is again a part of the outreach that the outreach plan that NCDOT Communications helped us with. They really worked very hard with trying to coordinate with community organizations throughout the state in order to get good feedback for the plan. So this is just a short snapshot of some of the folks that we've engaged with, community colleges, the university college system, HBCUs, NC Council of Churches, AARP, all chambers of commerce, county school systems, YMCA, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, the NC tourism industry, the outdoor industry. And then of course, I worked very closely with the stakeholders that, Jason mentioned earlier, our regional, division stakeholders with the MPO, RPO representatives, local government, to try to get the word out about the plan and to get more participation in the survey. Next slide, Jason. And then this is just a snapshot of some of the results. So this map here at the bottom shows the per capita survey responses by county. And so I think overall we did a pretty good job with trying to get representation throughout the state. We are a little behind in some of the eastern portions of the state with input, but we are hoping to, get additional input as we go with the draft network, and then the draft plan review, and then of course implementation, really improving that once we're able to meet in person again. And then yeah, so this is another little snapshot of the survey results. We really got great public feedback, so that was excellent to see. I think the vast majority of folks who did respond were very supportive of the project. So over 86 respondents said that the Great Trail State Plan wasn't extremely important or very important to them. And then this shows, this graphic here shows some of the popular destinations that folks are interested in getting to by trail. And then also what are the high priority benefits for trail usage. And so, and then like I mentioned, so our next phase, which we're currently in of public engagement, is review of the draft plan and the draft network. So the draft network we're almost finished with public review. Comments are due by tomorrow. And so we utilized publicinput.com to be able to get the draft network out to folks. It's really a great resource to where folks can publicly comment, people can agree, they can reply to different comments. And then they can easily look at the draft maps, download presentations, and get like a full view of the network in order to really comment on the network. And then we're going to do the same thing in the draft plan in January for the public, and that will be the final step for this planning process for community engagement.
Awesome, thanks so much, Katherine. And I just wanted to commend NCDOT on the great job with a lot of the outreach that was done, having 80,000 something impressions for the plan, even 11,000 actual surveys back. But I mean, it's just pretty incredible to have that sort of outreach and awareness about the plan itself. So some of the next steps here, we have a final committee meeting in February. We are going to the Board of Transportation with a presentation sometime as soon as we can get on the agenda, probably March. But that's just the very beginning. It's the end of the planning process, but it's the very beginning for our project and for implementation. So just a couple final thoughts before we go to Q&A. I know there was a few questions that came in. One thing is just thinking about the long term. What could we accomplish within the next 5 years, 25 years, maybe even 100 years? It's hard to think that far into the future sometimes, but when you're talking about a project of this scale and scope, it's not unreasonable to think that we might be doing this for a long time to get it all done. And we don't know what it'll look like in the future either. If you look at the Raleigh Greenway Plan as an example, the Capital Area Greenway Plan, with that vision in the 70s for what it could be to today, it's about 50 years, and there are 100 miles of that on the ground. I think the original plan back in the 70s was looking at 200 miles. And so in one sense, you might look at that example and think, gosh, that's 2 miles a year. How are we ever going to do the Great Trail State? But the other way to look at it is that's just Raleigh. And so if you think that we might be able to do things like this all across the state, especially with the Carolina Thread Trail and the Piedmont Legacy Trails, now there's the Triangle Trails Initiative as well. With these organizations combined with the East Coast Greenway and parts of the MST, there's just so much potential to expand the system, and I think it'll be good for us all to think about the long term in that sense. And just wanted to end on this quote because the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. Second best time is right now, and so I think that really applies to this plan as well. We could have been making a lot of progress over the past couple decades, but we should just continue on with what we're doing. That's what's most important, is that we get started on this plan. We assess how we're doing, we adapt and continue as we move forward. So I think with that, we can turn it over to some of the Q&A that's been coming in, and we can take it from there.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Great presentation. We do have some questions that have come in, so I will go ahead and ask our speakers some of the questions, and if you all can field those, that'd be great. So the first question that came in is from Paul, and he says, "Hi, thanks for presenting. Great idea. Can you comment on studies that are underway to refresh economic impact locally? In looking at meta-analysis of all economic impact analyses in the US, the return on investment seems to range from about $1.72 to $11 for $1 of initial capital investment. Methodologies vary, but it would seem that the average return is much higher than 1.72. If you need me to repeat that, I know that's a big question.
No, I got it. So the reason you're seeing 1.72 there is because, well, first of all, it was a very conservative study in terms of what we were projecting. But the big difference between this study and other studies that are similar to it is we are not projecting an increase in property value. And that is because when we dove into the way that's been done in other studies, it's actually, you know, it's really hard to point to what is driving property value increases. So you may have an area where a new trail went in, and you may have, you know, within that same corridor, a school got built, or within that same corridor, you had other types of investment that could impact that property value. And so we found that it was just, you know, until there's a better way to do it, we felt better leaving it off of that. But I do understand that, you know, that's going to be the big driver that would shoot this up quite a bit. So we wanted to be conservative in this. We wanted to do what we knew was real in terms of, you know, making that projection. But yeah, certainly property value would be a big aspect of that.
Yeah, and I also just want to say one other thing,
And
Jason. So, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jake.
I was just going to say, I mean, there is a recommendation in the plan that there needs to be more studies on economic and health benefits of trails. And that's definitely a recommendation to work with research partners to make that happen, to have more local in North Carolina specific studies.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say. So, yeah, we at NCDOT realize the importance of, you know, that economic impact data and justifying trail development. And so we do want to invest more resources into additional economic impact studies, you know, in addition to our 2017 report.
The last thing I'll mention about that is just that when you think about property value and economic impact and benefits, not all communities would consider increased property value a benefit. That's the other aspect to consider in terms of equity and planning and gentrification. It's just, you know, we've seen it on the Atlanta Beltline, on all sorts of projects across the US where, you know, that's a big part of the conversation.
Great, thank you all so much. The next question is from Dave, and he says, might there be recommendations to add more parks to the state system as well?
I would certainly hope so. Can anybody, Katherine or Jake, do you?
Yeah, well, I mean, so we're partnering very, very closely. And I think maybe we could have focused on that a little bit more as well in this presentation. But, you know, Smith Rayner with NC State Parks, she has been a huge part of this process and really helped guide us. And we're working closely with, you know, NC State Parks on this project. And as we move on with implementation, this will really be a joint NCDOT, NC State Parks project. And so that would, of course, be something in their realm. But, you know, that's something that we can look at, you know, as we move on with implementation and we strengthen our partnership with state parks.
And Smith and her group has been doing such a great job of expanding their trail system too. And you can see here a lot of the new, you know, designated state trails that are across the state. And it's just really exciting to see those come together too.
Great, thank you so much. That actually ties into our next question, which is from Jennifer, and she wanted to know, are all the North Carolina state trails included in this plan?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. He said, yeah. Well, yeah, no. So not all the state trails are included in as a part of the network. So since this is an NCDOT funded project, we want to make sure that the trails that are included in the network do serve multimodal purposes. So being able to walk and bike on those trails. So we are making sure that we do have connections to state trails and to state parks, but some of the state trails are hiking only, and we have to respect that those will not be multimodal, and so they will not be included in the network. But like, for example, let me just use Mountains to Sea. So in the West, some of the corridor, is not a part of the Great Trail State Network, but we are providing those connections to it. But in the East, where there's a lot of segments of the MST that are paved, that is a part of the network. So it really just depends.
Great, thank you so much. Our last question is also from Jennifer, and she was wondering when and where maps will be available for distribution.
Well, yeah, as soon as we adopt the plan, so like Jason showed on the earlier slides, we do have those 14 division stakeholder maps, and we're really going to make sure that they are sent out to everyone, NPOs, RPOs, trail organizations, different community organizations that we've worked with, county commissioners, etc. But of course, they will be available on our website. We have a Great Trail State webpage on the NCDOT website. So they'll be available there. And then I'm sure that they're going to be available on all of our partner websites as well.
Katherine, isn't there a draft version that's available right now where you can?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so the public input page, and I can send you the link to that. I don't think we have the URL on those slides. But yeah, I can send that out, and all the draft maps are currently online.
Yeah, in fact, if I can put that in the chat, Addie, or something in a minute.
That'd be great.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a chat for all of our attendees. There's a chat box, and so the presenters can put that link in the chat for you all to access. Those are all of our questions at the moment. I'm really grateful to everybody who submitted a question and to all of our speakers for the time and effort you've put into this and the great work that you're doing. Unless anybody has any questions, any remaining questions, or the speakers would like to clarify anything, I think that's a wrap.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, and I have the link right now. I'm gonna put that in before we end our presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Yep, everybody can find that in the chat for this session, which is located to the right of the video stream. So thank you all.
Thank you, Addie, and thanks everybody.
Thanks so much.